there were three things, right? There was JavaScript, of course, which was the dynamic part of client-side application, and then I had HTML and CSS. So let's talk briefly about HTML and then talk about CSS more. So we've looked over this now. 1 second. Right. So this was the structure of an HTML file, and it was first of all, HTML is a tag language, right? So what's happening here is I have a bunch of text, and I'm basically underlining the text, right? So I'm marking some text. It's like putting parentheses around the text, and the parentheses have semantic values. So they tell me what the text is supposed to mean. And for example, if I look, all the text in this document is marked as HTML. There's two main parts here. One of them is with things which aren't directly shown, which is head. And if I look at what I've written in head for this really simple HTML file, I have a meta tag. Now this tells me what the text is represented like. And in this case, it's going to allow me to read this bit. Right. So that couldn't be interpreted through as an ASCII character, but because I have UTF-8, it's going to be correctly displayed. Although this is, we're going to see if we play with fonts in CSS, we might still run into some problems here. Now the second part is the body, and the body contains stuff which is directly shown. Now let's look a bit at how this looks like. 1 sec, let me just find the appropriate directory. And this was file number 3. Right. So it doesn't look all that great, but if I inspect it, I'm going to see a couple of interesting things. So first of all, I can see the structure, right? And there is something which is tree-like here. So I have a root, and then I have something below it. And for each of these elements, I can actually notice, if I go to properties, what the structure that was built by the browser behind the scenes is. Right? Because I said it's a document object model that is a tree of objects representing the tags in my document. And this looks exactly like I would imagine it would look. That is, each of the nodes has a bunch of characteristics, of properties. There's a bunch of them, we're not going to go through them. However, I can also see it has a collection of children, and this is the minimalistic representation of a tree. Okay, now there's two perspectives over HTML. So if I look at the first website, I think we've already seen this, but and I look at the source for this website, UPage source. The attitude towards what an HTML should be was a bit different, right? So HTML was initially imagined as a language to define documents, but it evolved from that point to a language to define structure. Right, so these two perspectives are actually visible in current HTML in the sense that the initial tags had a bunch of presentation in them. Right? They were supposed to look in a certain fashion, whilst the modern tags try to not have any kind of presentation, to separate presentation from structure, but they try to have more complex semantics. Right? They try to tell you what something means more than what something looks like. But this is the old version, and for example, this is a heading and so forth. Now, from the old version, we still have a bunch of tags. These tags represent, let's call them it's a command palette, so to speak, of a set of controls and visual elements that I can use in a web page. Now, this is to see this idea that there's a presentation element to old HTML. Here I have some headings. They're marked with H1 through H6, and these definitely have some presentation elements in the sense that they obviously look different, right? It's they look in a certain way. We're going to see when we use only modern stuff that they don't look in any way. Right? They don't have any display characteristics. And it's left to me to add CSS to make them look a certain way. So the purpose is a bit different. So these two attributes, so these are my headings. These have existed in HTML since the beginning. And this is a div. Now, a div is an anonymous division. So it's something that just groups a bunch of content, and it doesn't look in any particular way. It doesn't mean anything. It just means this stuff is grouped. Now there's two of these tags which represent anonymous divisions, and they relate to another issue, which we're going to get back to at the CSS part, which is that broadly, when I think about showing something on a page, I can show it in two great categories, right? I can show it as if it were a paragraph, or as if it were a character. Now the first concept is called block display, and the second concept is called inline display. Now a block display, so which is div is a block division. A block display is something which doesn't allow anything to its left or its right. Right? It just takes up a horizontal band of the page, and that's it. And there's something before it, there's something after it, but there can't be anything next to it. And that's paragraph-like, right? Whilst an inline display, which is another element which is called span, means that it behaves like a character, which means that given a bunch of text, it's going to come after a character, and then it's going to be followed by some characters in the same row of characters. Make sense? This might deform the page because my span, which is something in line but maybe has dimensions, might be a lot higher than a character, but it just breaks up the text. So these are the two great categories. It's a bit more subtle than that, but at the fundamental structural level, I can at least define this, that it's something which is character-like or it's something which is paragraph-like. Now looking at these, because we're also going to get to CSS, let's also look a bit at the details here. I can, apart from what we've seen until now, I can see in the lower part here, on styles, I can see what styles apply. Since I'm separating presentation from structure, I obviously have to define presentation somewhere, and I'm going to define it with CSS, but at least some of these tags come with some pre-existing characteristics. Now, the characteristics, the display characteristics of a particular tag are going to be represented as a bunch of key value pairs, right? These are obviously have to be supported, so some of them are valid on some tags, some of them are not. But in this case, what it says is display block. This means it's shown somewhat like a paragraph-like. And because we're in OD HTML, it also establishes a font size. Now, again, we're going to go back to this, but this is a measurement, right? And it's a measurement I probably haven't seen before. Because if I think of measurements, CSS supports a bunch of measurements, but if I think of measurements, I would think about something which is screen-like or something which is international system-like. So pixels or centimeters, something like that. Well, this is something which is CSS-specific, and what it does, it tells me that the font size for this H1 tag is going to be 2 times whatever the normal font size is. What does that mean? Well, notice that when I increase the normal font size, this is proportional, right? So it maintains its proportion. This is the normal font size, and if I change it, the heading 1 is just going to be 2 times larger, right? Which is really useful to scale interfaces because it's going to be something which is adapts to a particular screen while keeping the way my page looks. There's a bunch of other things here. We're not going to dwell on them. Suffice it to say, each of these headings has its own little different size, which is somewhat arbitrary. But notice that the tags themselves came with some characteristics from the browser. So there were some hard-coded characteristics, which I can overwrite, right? But something exists there. And this reflects that initial attitude of actually drawing documents instead of defining structure. This is 4, let's go 5. Now, this is a bit of a sidetrack, but since I want to represent text in HTML, the text might be HTML. So I might make a page which explains HTML tags. So I need some sort of an escape syntax, because if I just write a tag, it's going to be interpreted. And then, who knows? what I get. And this is the escape syntax for HTML. It's ampersand less than, well, ampersand less than and a semicolon. Hello. Ampersand less than, ampersand greater than, because if I look at the tags themselves, the tags look like this, right? So it's a less than followed by the name of the tag followed by a greater than. So I have to escape those things. And just like I would in, say, backslash escaping in C strings, I have to escape the ampersand. I have to escape the escape, which is amp. Right, so I can actually write HTML tags here. Like I said, this is something to know, but which you might rarely go into. Now, this is another interesting bit. Why is this? Why do I have more spaces here? Well, notice that I've used another escape which says NBSP, a non-breaking space. Now, in modern pages, you're not going to have this. But it reflects, again, something about the nature of the language. So, NBSP is a space which the browser cannot collapse. But what is collapsing about? Well, collapsing refers to the fact that whenever a browser runs into multiple spaces or multiple space-like characters, so tabs, enters, it's going to collapse them, that is, replace them with one space. And why is that? Because it seems strange, right? Why would I do that? Well, I'm going to do that because my attitude in HTML is that I'm just establishing what the content is. I am assigning meaning to the content, but then the drawing part is the browser's task. I'm not interested in how things are drawn. And I don't know, let's force it to see. Okay, I'm gonna see, for example, I'm not going to decide how many characters are on a line. The browser is going to handle that for me. And one consequence of this is that it's going to replace spaces with consecutive spaces with one space, which I can avoid with NBSP, but like I said, this is I can actually do this from CSS. I'm not going to do this in real life. This is obviously almost unreadable, so not a great advantage. But the concept that the browser handles the way things are shown is still going to be present. Now, if I want, like I said, I don't decide what's on one line or another line, but if I do want to decide, I might want to think about what the reason for that is. Well, why would I want to decide how many characters are on a line? Well, if and only if, I might want to decide that, if and only if, those characters have semantic value, right? So I have two lines because there's two different things, whatever those things may be. And if there's two different things, I should mark them as being two different things. In this case, there's two paragraphs. And these are going to easily be displayed on different, say, lines. Now here, though, yes, I haven't decided. This is one thing. And because it's one thing, the browser is going to decide how it's shown. This is 6, I think. 1 sec. See? So this bit, the browser decides how many things are on one line. Whilst these two, I've marked them as being separate things. Right? They're separate paragraphs in this case. Now the last bit, which is the if statement, is a pre-formatted block of text, and what it does is it keeps the formatting of the text, including the leading spaces and stuff. So it's shown exactly how I've written it here. That's how it's going to be shown on the page. The purpose for this is what you're seeing on the screen now, which is if I want to say show code in an HTML. However, again, in more modern times, and we're going to see this as an example when we get to writing our own servers. In more modern times, I have mechanisms which are a lot more flexible, right? So I can use some JavaScript to have syntax highlighting and line numbers and all that jazz. So this is something that exists, but we're just looking at it for historical purposes. Now, it's called hypertext, right? What's so hyper about hypertext? What does that refer to? Well, it refers to the fact that I have links. The traditional way of navigating large amounts of text used to be indexes, right? Which is you look at a list of concepts and it tells you page 23 or something. Now, when you talk about the truly large amount of text, such as all the text on the internet, this will not do. And the radical idea behind the web, which is why it's called the web, is that you can refer any document or any part of a document from any other document. right? So I can just click a link and it's going to navigate me somewhere else on the internet. Of course, this has some prerequisites, such as things being addressable and so forth. But this is at this point, it doesn't seem like much, but it is a radical idea. Now, if I look here, so this navigates to 3.html. Because I have unspecified server or port or anything, it's going to assume that it's a file delivered on the same protocol from the same server, from the same directory where this file exists. Right, so it's there with me. What's interesting is target blank. Now, target blank does something which is useful, but that's not the interesting part. The useful thing is that it opens a page in a new tab. The interesting part here, though, is that it's an atavistic feature which has remained from one of the few things that have been taken out of HTML. Right, so generally, when I talk about the web, if something exists, a feature exists, it's going to be kept. And see JavaScript, because I said that there's a web page from '98 which uses some bizarre way of using JavaScript, and we still have to support that. Well, in this case, there used to be a feature in HTML which is called frame sets, which is one of the few features that were taken out because it was unpopular and it didn't quite work. The second thing I want to note here is that I can customize a tag by using some attributes. Right? And attributes are key value pairs. They're inside the open tag, and they are separated by space. So in this case, I have two attributes, one which is href, HTTP reference, it's a link, and the second which is target. Notice that the attributes, I can write, the attributes are strings. And I can write them between double quotes, single quotes, or, as in this case, I can just omit any kind of quotes. Now, I can omit any kind of quotes with one condition, which is that the value of the attribute doesn't get, it doesn't create confusion for the parser. When would the value of the attribute create confusion for the parser?
When it has spaces.
When it has spaces, right, because that's the separator, but that I would have to use single or double quotes when I have spaces. Now, for the second link, notice that it navigates the file system, right? So it navigates the file system on the server to get me something from a different directory. In this case, it says, well, this 7HTML is in it's somewhere in a directory, and there's a subdirectory called sandir, and in that subdirectory, there's a 2.html. Conversely, if I look at this 2.html, this actually does something else, which is it navigates to something in the parent directory. Right? So the way of navigating, the way you can navigate the directory structure on the server is just like you would for operating systems. So dot is the current directory and dot is the parent. And this is actually enough to navigate the tree structure with a bit of effort, of course. So let's see 7 and by consequence 2. Right, so it opens something in a new tab. Right. This actually goes here, and I can navigate. So I went to a subdirectory, and then I went to the parent again. Okay. Right. Now, let's do a short run through for what I have at my disposal, and let's note what's interesting. So, I have a series of basically visual controls which I can use in any web page and which I can assume work on any browser. The first of this is the idea of a list. Now, I have unordered list and ordered list, both of them containing list items. Interestingly enough, though, let's see. So unordered list means that the bullet of the list is going to be a bullet, a little circle, while ordered list means it's going to be a number. But there is something interesting here. So I said that that generally I can talk about displaying things like a paragraph or displaying things like a character. Well, in this case, it's going to be a bit special because, and it's justified because, see, if I look at this list item, right, it says display list item. Right, so for a paragraph, it would say display block style, and for the character is going to say display inline. An example of inline display is going to be the links that we've seen. The links are displayed inline. But this is display list item, and in this case at least, it's important. It's important why? Well, for each of these elements that I have in my page, the browser, on the one hand, is going to keep the DOM object, but on the other hand, is going to keep a little rectangle which it's going to draw. Right? So I have to, when drawing the page, the browser's objective is to determine how the little rectangle representing that element is drawn, what pixels are in it. Right? Because I said that the way that the page is rendered is I'm going to start from the leaves. The leaves are little rectangles, and then I can assemble them, so to speak. Because if I know all the children of something, I can draw the parent. Of course, given some additional information. I have to know how large the parent is, where the children are positioned, etc. We're going to see this next time. But in this case, it's not quite true, is it? Because this is not one little box. It's actually two little boxes which move together. Because on the one hand, I have the content of the list item, and on the other hand, I have the list marker, which is the bullet in this case, or the number. Which I can change. We're going to see this to a certain extent while looking at CSS selectors. Right, so there's a bunch more values for displays, for this display property, which relate to particular cases, such as the idea of a list item. The second thing we might want to see, and again we have to discuss about something interesting, is this is a table. Right, so I can make a table, and the table has, again, it's not really important to remember the details, but the table has two types of children, which are table header and table body. The reason why I didn't say, and it has also a footer, but the reason why I didn't say it has a table header and a table body is that there can be multiple, and I can mix them. And each of these contains table rows, which contain table cells. Now the cells are a bit different for heading, headers and body, but that's not interesting. Notice that I said each of these contains table rows, but it's not true here. Okay? But what's going to happen when we open this in the browser? It's 9. One sec, because okay, 9. Well, this is an image, which is called the image source. But first, let's look at this. Notice that I do have a table row in the browser. I didn't write it, but I do have it. Now, this reflects another attitude, which is if I write mildly broken HTML, the browser is going to compensate for me. And that's the attitude of it's going to try to make it work. Now, in any context I might be, the browser is going to try to make it work for me. If I write an invalid CSS property, the browser is going to ignore it, and that's it. I'm not going to, generally on the web, I'm not going to get errors unless I do something really egregious. But in this case, it just compensated for me. So, for example, if I write a table and I write some rows in it, and that's it, the browser is going to create a table body around them, and so forth. Now, this is an image. It's not really all that interesting. The subject of the image is a bit more interesting. Do you know what this is? This is the first personal computer. Actually, the Altair 8800. Let me just pause this for, oh no, I can't. Right, I'll tell you the story at the end. But so this is an image, and the image is going to be one case of multimedia content, right? So this is something which is going to be transferred separately over HTTP as text, right? Because that's how HTTP works. So this is the original, the grandfather of multimedia content. However, in modern HTML, I also have tags for audio and for video, which are going to handle other kinds of content. And I used to have tags for abstract multimedia content, which were called object, but that didn't prove to be all that successful. Now, here, so what I'm going to do with HTML, like I said, is going to define structure. And in this case, what I'm going to define is the classic web page structure. I think we can just draw it just for reference. Let me see, do I have internet? we have a thing which we can use to draw. Right, so the structure I'm defining here is I have a page, which is the container. The page has a header and a content part. And in the content part, I have a sidebar. Right? This is a structure you've seen a million times. Okay, so notice, if we go back to the source, notice that this is exactly what I've said here. So I said div, and this is another thing. So we've seen we have attributes for HTML which customize the behavior of a tag. But some of these attributes are global attributes, they're called. So any tag has them. And there's a bunch of them. However, we've seen one last time, which is ID. And ID tells me that that particular tag has a particular identifier or name, or how you might want to call it. And that's unique. However, class actually tells me that this particular tag, div, is part of a group of tags which have similar characteristics. In this case, it's a page. Now, the class attribute is another global attribute just like ID, and it can contain multiple values which are space separated, which brings us back to why I can't ignore the quotes every time. But if I look at it, so I say, okay, so there's a container, which is the page. Then inside of it is something with class header. Then inside of it, apart from the header, there's a main part, which contains a sidebar and a view. The sidebar containing probably some sidebar items. Okay. Now, I'm using divs, which are anonymous divisions. And let's look at it so we can just see. Well, it doesn't look in any way, right? This is perfect. It has no presentation information whatsoever. And we are now waiting for presentation information to come from CSS, right? But this, we start from zero. What we wanted was to start from zero with the presentation, and we have this. Awesome. This is a bit different from what I had when I used, for example, headings, right? Because headings did look in a particular way. Right? I have to take that into account. But there is a problem here, which is, notice that basically I've used anonymous divisions, and I've used the class attribute for something else. Right? And basically what I've done is I've used the class attribute for semantics. That's not really a div. It's a div which is actually the container. And this is not actually just a div. It's a div which is actually the header. Now in modern HTML, some tags have been added to the standard which represent exactly this situation. That is a div which is a header. So I have a tag called header, for example, which is going to be a div, the equivalent of what I've written here. So it's going to be something which is displayed as block, which has the semantics of a header, but that's it. And we can see this in an example. Right? So in this case, this is going to be the equivalent of my div with the class header, because I don't necessarily have to use, I want to associate the semantics without having to use the class attribute. Now this is not going to look like nothing, like we saw earlier, because I have these headings, right? And these headings look like something. They have display characteristics. Make sense? Right. So let's look at this as well. Right. So the headings are stick out. They don't work to the same rules. But we should actually use some CSS to take out the to revert them to the regular display. But it's too much effort. So we might just as well style the page itself. Right, so I have these semantic things. Now, apart from these display elements that I have, which are tables or lists or images or videos or all that, I also have to have some input, right? Because when HTML was first imagined, it was imagined in relation to some sort of applications, right? It wasn't just content. It was something with which you could interact. Because what's the point of communicating in the network if you can't have actions from users, coordination between users? Right, so this is a form, and the form contains a bunch of input controls. This reflects the initial vision, let's say. And in this case, my inputs are input type text, it's a text input type submit, it's a special input which looks like a button. So the initial mentality was the following. I have a form, I input some data, I click on submit, and then something default, something automatic happens, which is the input of the form is taken and the list is created, which is URL encoded. That is encoded like you put it in an URL. And whatever is in the, that's a list of key value pairs, whatever is in the name property is going to be the key, and the value is going to be whatever the user supplied. Right. So when I press submit, this is all going to be packed, and it's going to be sent via this method to this action on the server. Right? So the general way of thinking about it and the flow of a traditional web application used to be this. I load the page contains form, I fill in the form, I press the submit button, request is sent to server where my input is interpreted, and I get a new page which contains another form. And I keep doing this, and this is the gist of the application interaction. Make sense? Right, so that's how it was initially imagined. Now there's a bunch more input types. We're going to see on the one hand, we're going to see the traditional ones in the next example, and then the new ones. Right, so notice again that there are some controls in HTML which have default behavior. Right? The simplest one is a link. When I click on a link, it navigates. And remember that last time we had a way in which we can intercept this, and we can actually prevent this default behavior if we need to. Because our applications are not going to work like that. Whether they have forms or not, they're not going to submit stuff in this way to the server. Rather, they're going to handle the click on a button, and they're going to manually, in a controlled fashion, they're going to make requests from JavaScript. Right? They're not going to rely on the browser. Okay. All right. Of course. 1 sec. Yeah, and it's interesting to make it fail. Obviously, we don't have test CGI. What's the action written there? So let's see a couple of things. So first, let's write something with a space. Right, and if I look at network, it failed, obviously. However, I can see what I sent. And what I sent was this. It was a post, so I had something in the request body. And it said first, which was the name of the input, is this, and the spaces were replaced with plus because it's URL encoded. If I have multiples of them, they would be separated by ampersand, right? So it'd be key equals value, ampersand, second key equals second value, ampersand, third key. We're going to see it shortly. Right, so CGI comes from Common Gateway Interface, and it was the initial way that reading parameters from the client was imagined. We're not going to write in this fashion, but it's interesting to know. If you want to write a web application in C, that would be interesting. Right. This is not. We have this to see something else. So this particular form doesn't specify any action in any method. Again, there are some defaults at play. If I don't specify any action or any method, what's going to happen is the action is going to be assumed to be the current file, which makes no sense whatsoever, and the method is going to be assumed to be get, which means the parameters are going to be sent through the link, not inside the request body. Right? So let's just see this. Again, this bit is not necessarily all that interesting, but if I write this, notice that I have this in the list of parameters. Right? So the query parameters, that is, they're sent after the question mark. Now let's see traditional controls, and then let's see more modern controls and discuss how they came about and what the idea is here. So traditional controls. Right, so the label bits allow me to have some text describing the control, which presumably is going to move with the control, right? Because if I want to style this, probably what I want to do is have the label on the left or on the right or whatever of the text input. I have to move them together to make sense. Anyway, so I have one input type text. There's an input type password, which isn't more secure, rather it doesn't show on the screen the text you're inputting in case somebody's looking over your shoulder. Then I have radio buttons. Now radio buttons mean that I can only choose one of them. Right? It's, whenever I Notice that they have the same name. Thus, if I select one of them, the other become deselected. That's the definition of a radio button. Checkboxes. Now, for checkboxes, they're going to allow multiple selections. That's what checkboxes are. And in this case, I notice that I do have something strange, which is this bit. Now, this obviously says that the checkbox starts pre-selected. It starts from a true value. And this is a special kind of attribute. It's equivalent to writing check equals true. But since it's a Boolean attribute, its presence is true and its absence is false. Right? So if it exists, it means it's true. If it doesn't, it means it's false. So it's a simplified way of writing things. And then I have a combo box or a select, and the select is going to work just like in any other languages by having a display value, which is this, and an actual value, which is what you get when it's selected. Again, if you run into combo boxes as a control in any language, that's going to be the behavior. Each of the options is going to have two associated things: a label, what you're seeing, and the value, what you're selecting. It's more a matter of convention. Yeah.
I have a question about the radio buttons. Don't they need to be inside the radio group? So
Not necessarily. It's going to work just as well. Right. Anyway, and this is an input type hidden. The idea here is I want to send a key value pair which has not been directly input by the user. Maybe I calculated something on the client, I don't know. But I wanted to go to the server. And of course the input type submit, which there's also an input type button, obviously. An input type submit, which we have here just so we can see how the list looks like. Let's see it in action. Right, and I have this whole thing, which is a list of key value pairs. Let me paste it here so we can better see it. Right, so some text equals some text, choice equals no, and so forth. Exactly what I'd imagine. This will be sent again when I press submit via the method to the action on the server. Make sense? Now, apart from these, at least apparently, I have a bunch more controls which have been added in modern HTML. Stuff like date inputs, selecting the number from a range, inputting an email, etc. Now, what's interesting here is that at the point that these were added, you couldn't predict when a particular browser is going to implement them. Right, they generally have some complex graphical artifact attached. Right, so a color selector, for example, is something where you have a panel and you click somewhere on a color. Right, so I can't actually say when the browser is going to implement. So what they actually are is disguised text fields. Right, so if the browser doesn't support a color selector, you're going to get the text field because the value would be a text value, a string value, what you would select. But if the browser does support it, you're going to have somewhat more friendly. Right? So there's these. Some of them are supported, some of them are not supported. It depends on your browser version, on operating system X, etc. But this is not the interesting bit. Like I said, the interesting bit is that from the beginning, it was imagined in such a fashion that it doesn't matter if your browser doesn't support it yet. Make sense? And let's see both of them. Now, this is always hit and miss in the sense that in the meantime, the browser might have supported whatever was used in this example. For example, this is a text input with a different face. But see, it's a bit complex. So it's not, if I were to implement this in C, right, it's not necessarily trivial. Right? So they're disguised text inputs. How about this one? This one is supposed to have a validator. Well, it's just a text field, right? But it still works. As an aside, just as a note, any kind of client-side validation is a matter of ease of use. It's not a matter of integrity or security. If you want to validate data for reals, you have to validate it on the server. Because whatever your interface is on the internet, on the web, where everything is open, I can circumvent it. It doesn't matter what validators you put. You have to validate on the server. On the client, you're just doing it to help me, the user, not be confused, right, about what I'm supposed to input. Right. This is not relevant. So this is our tour of HTML. Our interfaces are going to be written under the hood. They're going to be HTML. However, much of it is going to be written in something which is called JSX, which looks like HTML but actually isn't, and it's going to be dynamically populated. For example, if I look at this bit and I do view page source, you're going to see that the page, the page looks horrible. But you're going to see that the page is just this. It's not much. My HTML page is a page which contains just a div with the ID root. That's it. And the rest is generated automatically from JavaScript. It's attached, it's detached, it's rebuilt, etc. Right. So this would be our small tour of HTML. Tell me if you have any questions up until this point.
Still about the radio buttons, how do they work? How does it know that if I change?
They have the same name. Right. Notice that. So, one sec. Where was I? Here? Right. So they have the same name.
So if I put another radio button below,
And it has the same name, it's going to be part of the same group. Right, so the radio buttons work in the sense that
they link by the name.
Yes, there's one value for that name.
Okay.
There's one value. Right. The idea is these are basic controls, and they can be used behind the scenes, so to speak, right? Because they're not going to look like this. In any application you can see on the internet right now, they're not going to look like what I have here. Not here. Here. This is the minimalistic version, right? But you do have them, and these are the fundamental controls. Other questions pertaining to the HTML? Oh yeah, and something else which I want to mention. I was talking about global attributes, right? So I have a bunch of global attributes. Traditionally, I have IDs, I have classes, I have styles directly on the controls, etc. I also have some new ones which allow me to, for example, put a hotkey, right, to associate a hotkey to access a control, or to say if I navigate with just the keyboard, when do I get to it with tab index. But that's not necessarily the interesting bit. The interesting bit is there's an attribute which is a global attribute, which is called content editor. And that means I can make any tag into an input control. Right? I can have a div which is content editable true, and that means I'm going to be able to change its content. So the difference between, like I said, we're not going to rely on the traditional flow in which I have a form which I submit. I just have a JavaScript event somewhere which triggers a request on the network. That request triggers some sort of data load from the server, and I'm going to see the results. Right. So a couple of tags we've skipped. We've already seen one of them. Is I can use a tag called script in which I can run some JavaScript. Right? And by the same token, I can use a tag called style in which I can use some CSS. Ready for CSS? Let's CSS. Now, what is CSS? Well, we've seen some hints of what CSS is. CSS is a difficult technology to love, but it's the best that we do have. And if I look here, I'm going to. No, I don't want network error. Let's go to something more friendly. If I look here, I'm going to see a couple of things. So thing number one, this is what is called the CSS rule. This one came from the browser, right? The form has some characteristics. It's display block, it has to have margins, etc. Obviously, forms exist since HTML existed, so they do have some sort of graphical set of characteristics predefined. Right. So my CSS rule is basically made up of two things. So one of them, which is form, is a search expression. There's two halves of CSS, and we're going to talk about the first half first. First of all, CSS has to take the structural tree and it has to associate various display characteristics to the nodes. Right? It has to be able to tell, I don't know, some div or paragraph that the text is supposed to be blue. I have to be able to say this one is blue and this one is green. Right, but in order to be able to set these characteristics, what I need to have is some way of selecting the nodes I'm referring to. Right? Which one? And if I want to make a series of nodes have blue text, I have to get somehow the list of the nodes I want to make blue. Which means the first bit of CSS is the search expression bit, and which is a language to select a set of nodes in a tree. Right? They're called CSS selectors, and it's a rather complex query language which selects nodes from a tree. Make sense? Right. Now I've selected them. Well, once I selected them, I can have this block of rules which are going to be key value pairs. So those nodes I've selected have some possible properties. And what I'm electing to do here is I'm going to leave some of those properties to the default value, the ones that I haven't mentioned, because there's tons of them. It's not just these three, obviously. And for the ones that I want different behavior, I'm going to say what value I want. In this case, display block, margin top, etc. Right. So let's open. Let's look at the. Right. So here I have some CSS, and I have three different things. Although it's, so the first thing, I have a style block, and we've actually by mistake seen this rule before. But that thing, which is sharp d1, says all elements, which is probably 1, with the ID d1. Right. So the sharp sign says this is an ID select. And for those elements, I said background color is something. That's a color represented in RGB, right? So they're the values between 0 and 255 for red, green, and blue. But you know, it's I'm actually helped. If I want to change it, I can just click this, and it's going to let me select something. This is pure red. Okay, so that's the first bit. The second bit refers to an external file. Now, if I wanted to do this for JavaScript, I would have had script source, src. In this case, it's a different thing, it's a different tag, which is called link. And link is going to include some external CSS file, which also says background color or something. Right, so I have 3 divs here, and the third one actually has a value in the style attribute. But the question might arise, which is, what if these rules refer to the same thing? What's going to be their precedence order? And this is another important discussion about CSS, which is important to understand, which is the idea of specificity. So if I have 2 rules which refer to the same property, I'm going to have to select one of the values, right? So one says it's blue, one says it's red. How do I reconcile? Well, first of all, I have to wonder if the way in which I've included the styles actually has some influence on this. Well, the style block and the link reference are identical in power, so to speak. They're equally, which means between identical things, identical rules of identical power, the one that's going to win out is the later one, right? So because the assumption is that you've corrected something, right? So there was a situation, you've elected to say something additional, right? That's because you wanted to correct something, to modify something existing. Right, so there's no relation, it just matters who comes later. As for the third one, right, which is on the style attribute, this actually does have more power. So this is more specific than anything that I could write in a style. And we're going to see specificity shortly. Now let's look at this and note something else. Which one is it? It's 5. One sec. Right. And if I inspect this, I can see so CSS means cascading style sheet. So I can see the cascade, right? So I can see how the rules came about and which one applied. Now this cascade is actually readable from bottom to top. I know that cascade would involve the rest, the other direction, but in this case, right. So what's lower is came earlier. So in order to draw this div with IDD1, what I did was this. So first it came with display block because it's a div and it came with that from the browser. Then that rule was matched and it said that background color is red. There's no competition here. So this is what I got as a color, and when the browser got to the rendering part, it drew it as red. Now what about this one? Well, this one I had the same kind of rule in the external CSS file, which says it was aquamarine. And this one, notice that it actually has something on element style. So I can look through this cascade and see why something applies. And I can also do this. So I can toggle them if I want, so I can see what would happen. There's another thing though, which is this bit here. Let's preemptively talk about that as well. So I have a box. There's a box. It's called the box model. So think about it like this. When I said that the browser is supposed to draw everything as a little rectangle, right? But what does this everything mean? So I have an image. Let's think about our image as if it were a painting, right? So if you think about the painting on a wall, first of all, I'm going to have the content, the painted area. Right, so it's this bit in the middle. Let me just, because we're recording, so it's this bit. This bit is going to be the content area. Now, then I have some space between the painting, the painted area, and the frame. Generally, paintings are not going to be tied to the frame. Right? They're going to be somewhere in the middle and some padding. So this is going to be this bit. Then I have the frame of the painting, which is border. And then I have the margin, that is the distance that my painting has in relation to other paintings on the wall. What is the minimum space it has to leave, right? Because I'm not going to crowd paintings together. They're not, if you think about it, they're not put frame to frame. Right, and this, actually, the box model, applies for anything that is drawn. Okay? So anything and everything that is drawn in a page is going to be drawn like this. Now, there's some subtleties to it, but we're not going to get to it today. Next time we're going to talk about the actual rendering process. Today we're just going to talk about the CSS selectors and how like I said, the first bit of CSS, which is how do I select nodes and associate properties to them. Our properties are going to be minimal, so they're just going to be colors and stuff like that. Right, so I said that an important concept is specificity, and that, at least until now, the only rule we have is that something that comes later is going to override something that comes earlier if their specificity is equal. Well, what is specificity? Well, let's see. It's I think it's just the next one. Yes. And let me just open the CSS as well. It's 6.css. Yes. One sec. And we can do this. Right. So let's look at the structure first. So for the structure, I have a div without anything. It's just a div. Then I have a div which has a class. Then I have a div which has a class and an ID. Okay? There's a reason why I selected these. Now, specificity, if we talk about it in general terms, if we invent the idea of specificity, there's a general principle which applies to anything. It's a logical principle which says that what is special derives from what is general. Right? That is, if you do say something specific, it's probably defining an exception from a general rule. Right? And at least on the surface in CSS, this is what's happening. In the sense that what I'm doing is I have something more specific which further defines something which was generically defined. Right? Unfortunately, in CSS, it doesn't quite follow the logical principle. There's going to be stuff which seems more specific, but actually isn't. So it is better to think about specificity in terms of a calculated set of numbers. So I have 4 positions here. So the first position is the specificity of something which is, or of a rule, which is put on the style attribute. I cannot obtain a 1 on that position unless I'm putting a rule on a style attribute. Right? I can't write something in a file. Okay. What about the second position? Well, the second position is a count of all the ID selectors. Right? Because here, my search expressions are really simple, but we're going to see that we can actually make them really complex. Now in this case, I have one ID selector, #1, right? Which means the specificity is going to be, I'm going to omit the first position, so it's going to be 100. I can actually see this here. If I hover about this, it says 100. Right. The second position, the second position here, right? So this one is going to be a count of how many class selectors I have and how many selectors equivalent to class selectors we're going to see shortly. And the third one is how many element type selectors I have, and in this case I have one again. So the reason why I've selected these three things is because they're the unit selectors, so to speak, right? So they have just one on that position. Right, so how do I compare them? When I compare them, how I will compare numbers, starting from the most significant digit. You can actually think about them as numbers, only they're in a really large base, right? So I can have something like 13, 7, 27. Although if you see this in real life, somebody is not doing their job. Because they're supposed to be readable, they're not supposed to be unreadable. The objective is not unreadability. Something which I might notice is that if the rule that what comes later applies over what comes earlier would apply, this would be the strongest rule, right? Because it's the latest. However, we're going to see that that's not what's going to happen, and what's at play here is specificity. Right. So if we inspect them, right? In this case, this is a div without anything, and it has background color orange. It's fine. What about the next one? This is the last one, right? Appearing. What about the next one? Well, I can see that here, this is the cascade I was talking about, right? So I have a div which is background color, div selector which has background color orange, but then I have a class selector which says everything with class alpha, and it says that background color is green yellow. And notice that these come into conflict. That one is more specific, and it's going to overwrite the orange, even though the orange came later. So the two rules I have to follow is rules in selectors compete on specificity, and at equal specificity, the latter one wins. Okay? So that's the thing. And we're going to have some exceptions, but it's not really all that complicated. This is the principle of it. Now what about this one? Well, to this one, everything theoretically applies, but notice that I had this rule, only this one was more specific, and this one was even more specific. Why was it more specific? Well, 100 is larger than 010, which is larger than 001. Right, so this is the idea of unit selectors. They're not really all that useful though, until now. So let's go further on. Why are they not useful? Well, if I were only to select stuff with the same class, or stuff with an ID, or stuff with a type, I actually have JavaScript functions for that. So I have getElement by ID, right? The equivalent of that stuff. But probably I need more complex expressions which have to define somehow relations within a tree. Right. So first let's look at this structure. So it's a div containing a p containing a span, then it's a div containing a span, there's some consecutive tags. Okay? Right, so because I'm in a tree, I have to somehow introduce the idea of going down in the tree. Right? I have to define relationships between which are parent-child. Otherwise, a selection language in a tree is useless if I can't define a parent-child relationship. Right? To say the node which is the child to the other kind of node. Well, this is what's happening here. So let's look at these selectors. So this one says, so it's div greater than span, and this means all the spans which are direct children of divs, direct descendants. Now, direct descendants means that the span has to be in the children collection of the div. Right? If there's something between the div and the span, this is not going to match. However, and this is somewhere where I have to be careful what I write, I have this selected. Now this says spans which are descendants, arbitrary descendants of divs. That means that the spans have to be found within the subtrees of divs, but they don't necessarily have to be children. Right? They can be grandchildren or something. They're just in the subtree. Right, so thing to notice number one, space is an operator. Right? Because it's a tree descent operator. If I were to read this, if I were to imagine the mechanism and read this from right to left, what I'd say for the first one would be, well, find all the divs, and then within the children, look for spans. And that's the result. In this case, find all the divs at line 9, and in their subtrees, look for spans. Which means that after you find all the divs, you have to go down at least one level. Okay? Make sense? So space is a tree descent operator. It's something which forces me to go down at least one level. Right, what about these? Well, these are something which reflects relationships not between parents and children, but between siblings. Right? So both of the things that I have there have to be within the same collection of children. Right? And then I can talk about having after. So span comes after image, right? And then I can talk about immediately after. Span comes immediately after, right? So it's immediately after means their indices are consecutive, whilst after means that the index of the second one is larger than the index of the first one, and they have to be in the same child collection. Now, another thing to notice. So first of all, what's the specificity of all of these? What do you think it is? And I think I showed it.
The first one comes first, the div.
No, just count it. What's the number, right? So I had the specificity where it was formed of 3 numbers on 3 positions, right? Position number 1 was IDs. Do I have any IDs? No. Position number 2 was classes. Do I have any classes? No. Position number 3 was elements. And in this case, I have 2 of them, div and span, which means the specificity equal to be 0, 0, 2. Now, here's the strange bit. Now, if I were to talk in pure logical terms, and I'd say, what is more specific, children or descendants, I would say that children is more specific. But this is not true for CSS. In this case, both of these selectors, because it's calculated, have the same specificity. It's obvious because they have 2 elements. Right? Which means that between them, which of one of them is going to win? The last one, right? So even though the last one seems, logically speaking, seems less specific, right? But it's not true. So it's useful to think about it as a number. It doesn't quite match the principle, the logical principle. They took the logical principle and went with it halfway. Yes, welcome to CSS. Right, so let's look at this. And notice what I said. Right, so this matches div span, right? This one. That's because the span is not a child of div. It's a descendant, but it's a grandchild. Although I'm not going to go with this. I'm not going to say grandchild and so forth. So it's a descendant. Whilst this one was a child, right? It was a child. Unfortunately, this came later, which means the mains is going to be blue-violet as well. Okay, so this one, right? So immediately after this, again, they're going to compete. They have the same specificity, and they compete. They compete based on which comes later. That's it. Right. So so let's expand a bit on these and see a couple more things. Now, let's say I have a list of things, any things. How would I style the first element differently? Well, I could put a class which says first. Now, how would I style the elements which are odd differently? Well, I could put on every odd element a class which says odd. But obviously this would overload my source, right? I would have classes over classes over classes. Which means that instead of doing that, I have some selectors which act as if I did that. These are called pseudo classes, right? It's classes you didn't explicitly put, but they act like you put them. And the reason is it makes your code a lot less brittle, right? Because I want to select the first element, and let's say that on the first element I did have a class called first, and then I put something before it. Well, I have to move everything, right? I have to rewrite the classes for everything. Right? So I have these pseudo classes. Now, what's the relation between pseudo classes and specificity? Well, so up until now I had first position was IDs, second position was classes, third position was elements, right? And now, on the second position, I'm going to add something more, and I'm going to say first position is IDs, second position is classes or pseudo classes, third position is elements. Right. Now, if I look here, it's a first child, which is something which is the first child of its parent. In this case, it's a list item, which is the first child of its parent. Last child. Also, there's another one which is called nth child, and this works in a couple of ways. So this is nth child of 3. This is the third one. Now, there's a gotcha here, which is that this is 1 based. It's the third one starting from 1. Then I have odd elements, and then obviously I also have even elements. This is really useful because in terms of visual design, if I have consecutive elements, I want to have some sort of visual separation between them. And I might have this visual separation using borders, for example. But if I do visual separation with borders, I'm going to lose some pixels, right? Some pixels are going to be useless, the ones in the border. So instead of doing this to not lose screen space, I can just alternate the color, and then it's going to be clear where everything finishes, even though I haven't lost any pixels. Make sense? Right, so I have this, and then I also have the possibility to put an expression here. Now this is not really, it's useful obviously for red and even. It's useful for a couple more cases, but I can put, no matter how, I can write 7n plus 13 there. Only the fact that I can do this is useless. If you see what I'm saying. I should never do this. There are some applications in case I want to group items in sets of something, of 4 for example, and I want to have a sort of gradient. And I want the first one to be, say, an intense blue, and then less blue, and less blue, and less blue, and so forth, and have this repeat every 4 elements, for example. So there are some design applications, but generally not that useful. Now, notice something else. The specificity for these is obviously 0, 1, 1, basically. And 0, 1, 1, because I have one element and one pseudo. The specificity is identical, so they're going to come into competition depending on who comes later. And something else, what would happen if I do this? What would that select? So before, it selected the list item which was the first child of its parent. But now, what does it select? It's an element which is the first child of its parent, which is present within the subtree of a list item. So whenever I put a space, again, remember, I'm going to have to descend one level of the tree at least. Right? So it no longer selects the same thing. Right, by the same logic, I'm going to have this case. So in this case, I have attribute selectors. So attribute selectors, if I think about it, so I have a bunch of input types, right? So there's different inputs. And obviously, the way I'm going to style an input text is going to be radically different from the way I'm going to style a checkbox. They have nothing in common visually. Which means I have to differentiate between them. And what I might do is I might say input type text, class text, so I can select it. But instead of doing this, I have attribute selectors. And the first one says an element which has a type attribute, as it defined. A type attribute exists on it. The second one is an element for which the type is password. Okay? And intuitively, these are counted on the class position. So again, I have ID selectors, then I have class selectors, attribute selectors, and pseudo classes, and then I have elements. Make sense? Right, and this one, so it's 9. Right, so it's the colors are different. It's like I said, all the examples are pretty colors. We're not. We want to focus on the selector bit for now, and we're not going to really worry too much about what is actually drawn. Now, attribute selectors actually have a more complex syntax, which is Baby's first regex, in the sense that the first one says class starts with ABC, the second one says class contains ABC, the third one says class ends with XYZ, and the last one is a bit stranger in the sense that it's a concept which doesn't exist in other places, which is called word contains. Right. What does word contains mean? It means that it's going to have to contain that as a separate word that is at the beginning of the string followed by a space, at the end of the string preceded by a space, or somewhere in the middle, both preceded and followed by a space, or just itself. So it has to be a separate word. So for example, if I look at the last one, so this one starts with ABC, it contains ABC, and it also word contains ABC. Okay? Whilst this one starts with ABC, contains ABC, but it does not word contain ABC because it's not followed by a space. Make sense? Right.
So it's like the regex.
Yeah. It's like I said, it's Baby's first regex, right? It's not. I don't have something even more complex than that. So I can't say repeating groups and all that. Okay. Now we had pseudo elements and pseudo classes, and pseudo classes for classes I didn't put there, right? But the browser considers acts as if I did. Now these are pseudo elements, and these are elements I didn't put there, but the browser acts as if I did. Now some of these I could put there. So for example, if I want to style the first letter in a paragraph, let's say I am rendering something which looks like an old tiny book, and the first letter of each chapter is larger. You know the typographical pattern with the first letter, which is larger, right? Let's say I want to do that. Well, what I might do is I could put a span around this L, but it's the same reasoning we applied earlier. This looks a lot uglier and harder to maintain. So instead, the browser assumes I did this, which means it assumes there's a distinct element, which is the first letter. Therefore, the first letter. Okay? Now, this I could have done. However, the second rule here, which is another pseudo element, I couldn't have done. Well, I couldn't have done from CSS. Because, as we talked earlier, I don't decide how many characters are on the line. I delegate this to the browser. So, what if I want to style that line? Well, either I have to wander from JavaScript, where it's actually rendered on the first line, okay, or I can use this pseudo element, which is first line, which allows me to not do all that. And the third one is something even more abstract, which I don't know how I could access. That is, it's the text selection. So let's see that as well. Now, as for specificity, right, so see, first letter is 4 times the text, first line is 2 times the text, and the selection is black on white, which would have been generally a bluish color, an undefinable blue color. Right, and this is the selection. I couldn't have selected this, right? It's impossible. This is not in the page. But in order to have graphical homogeneity, I have this pseudo element which is going to ask the browser to do this for me. Now, as for specificity, pseudo elements, because they're called pseudo elements, count as elements. Right? They're just they're counted on elements, which means that I now have IDs on the first position, then I have classes, attributes, and pseudo classes on the second position, and then elements and pseudo elements on the last position. Make sense? Right. Right. So let's. We don't have much time. I'm going to go a little bit faster for these. So this is I have a couple of more pseudo elements. These have to be used sparingly in the sense that if I look at the HTML, I'm no longer going to see all the content. This is actually going to insert content before the span. Now, the reason why these exist is, for example, if you look at line 11, I want to replace the bullets for less with little hearts. Right, so I can do this with before. Right. I couldn't have done this without this selector. However, like I said, to be used sparingly. Now, something else to note, let's see 13, is this. Now this is the important directive. What's with the important? Well, there's something to discuss here. So important is going to make my, is going to reset my specificity. That means that all the rules which are marked as important have stronger power than all the rules which are not marked as important. Okay? So that's the first thing. Between rules which are marked as important, the same specificity rules apply. Now, something to note, and you have to remember this, is that important is not there to cover your inability to organize your styles. Right? So if you're in control of all the code base and you've written even a single important, you've done something wrong. However, why is important there, right, if it's not for that? Well, if I use a third-party library with components, I don't have the code. I don't want to fork that library. What I want to do is customize that library in the actual case where I'm using it to fit with the rest of my application. And that is where I use important. Because what important does, it creates a new specificity hierarchy, right? So all the things which are under my control are not going to be with important, whilst the creator of the library is going to be act independently from me. Make sense? And I think the last one, because this is not relevant, we're going to talk about it next time, is this bit. So what this selects is everything with class alpha and without class beta, and it actually has the same specificity as .alpha.beta. Okay? The not bit is not a pseudo class, it's an operator. So I can just ignore it and count the specificity on the remaining bit. Okay? We note it specifically because it looks somewhat strange and it's easy to count it wrong. So that's about it. We're going to stop for today, and we're going to continue next time with the actual, because we haven't drawn anything.